The heavy iron lid of the cookie tin didn't clatter. It felt terrifyingly light as Karen pried it open in the jaundiced light of her kitchen. Instead of the thick roll of overtime cash she'd spent months welding in the smog to save, she found only scraps of grease-stained paper. A pair of tumbling dice printed on a receipt stared back at her, dated from 3 o'clock that morning, a time when her husband had supposedly been snoring in the next room. The rhythmic drip of the leaky faucet sounded like a countdown in the hollow silence, until the front door groaned open and the stench of stale booze and cheap tobacco flooded the hallway. Karen didn't move as Jim stumbled into the room, his shadow stretching long and jagged against the cracked wallpaper. She held the empty tin out like a silent accusation. But instead of an apology, she met a wall of sudden, violent fury. Jim's hand slammed onto the table, sending the receipts fluttering like dying moths, his eyes wide and bloodshot with a desperate, predatory light. As his fingers clamped painfully around her wrist to snatch the evidence, Karen realized the man standing in her kitchen was a stranger. And the $800 wasn't just money. It was the only thing keeping the wolves from their door. Heavy boots belonging to Karen McAllister sank into a viscous slurry of coal dust and slushy snow. The rhythmic screech of tortured metal still vibrated within her eardrums, a persistent hum that drowned out the infrequent honking of distant cars navigating the dying streets of Gary, Indiana. Karen peeled off her oil-slicked work gloves, exposing hands that were a map of labor. Reddened, thickened by years of welding, with industrial soot ground deep into the permanent crevices of her skin. The air in this corner of the world tasted perpetually of rusted iron. A thick, oppressive gray smog clung to the atmosphere, settling onto her eyelashes as a damp, chemical mist. Karen turned her head to look back at the thundering silhouette of the steel mill, a sprawling skeletal giant whose chimneys belched plumes of dirty orange flame into the encroaching twilight. Her shoulders felt like they had been carved from stone under the weight of a sweat-soaked jacket, and every breath she drew triggered a dull, radiating ache in a chest weary from 12 hours on the line. Crossing the threshold of her home, Karen stepped into an interior where the sharp scent of damp rot mingled with the stale, papery aroma of aging wallpaper. In the kitchen, she flipped the wall switch, but the low-wattage bulb merely cast a jaundiced light over the jagged cracks spiderwebbing across the ceiling. She reached into the pantry, pulling out a half-empty box of generic macaroni and a single tin of cheap canned meat. With a practiced, rhythmic motion, she scraped the last remnants of congealed sauce from the tin using a dull pewter spoon. Karen paused to straighten a lopsided curtain, trying to obscure the view of the boarded-up windows of the derelict house next door. Her fingers betrayed a slight tremor as she portioned the meager meal onto 2 chipped plates, purposefully piling Jim's mound of pasta slightly higher than her own. A heavy silence descended upon the room, punctuated only by the rhythmic, taunting drip of the kitchen faucet hitting the porcelain sink. Jim McAllister sat submerged in the hollows of a sagging armchair, staring fixedly at the black, lifeless glass of the television screen. The harsh glare of a street lamp cut through the window, striking his unshaven face and deepening the bruised shadows beneath his eyes. When Karen placed the plate on the scarred coffee table, Jim didn't so much as twitch his head. She placed a hand on his shoulder, seeking some flicker of connection, but Jim merely jerked his muscle, shrugging her palm away with a cold efficiency. When she asked about the promised call from the auto repair shop regarding work, Jim let out a short, dry rasp of a laugh, never breaking his study of the darkness in front of him. His fingers drummed a nervous, frantic beat against the tattered armrest while the dinner sat untouched, slowly filming over with a thin, translucent layer of cooling grease. Later, Karen entered the living room, carrying a mug of tea, and froze in the doorway. Jim straightened with a violent suddenness, and the cold blue light of a mobile screen momentarily illuminated his startled, wide eyes. With a frantic swipe of his thumb, Jim cleared a notification and shoved the phone deep into the recesses beneath the sofa cushion. Karen watched as a fine sheen of sweat broke out on the back of Jim's neck, despite the biting draft snaking through the house. Jim began to cough, a loud, staged, unnatural sound, while he pointedly avoided her direct gaze. She noted the way his jaw remained clamped shut, his face transforming into a rigid, impenetrable mask that barred her entry into whatever secret he was harboring. Karen stood on her tiptoes in the kitchen, sliding her hand onto the very top shelf of the cupboard, hidden behind towers of stale oatmeal boxes. Her fingers brushed against the cold, smooth tin side of a Danish butter cookie container. She pulled the vessel down, immediately struck by a terrifying lightness in the metal that caused her heart to skip a beat. A layer of undisturbed dust coated the lid, yet the edges felt suspiciously clean, as if recently handled by trembling hands. She pressed the cold tin against her chest, mentally counting every $10 bill she had painstakingly tucked away from grueling overtime shifts. Slowly, she pried the lid up with a fingernail. The tiny metallic click of the seal breaking sounded like a thunderclap in the hollow silence of the kitchen. Inside the tin, Karen found no thick roll of currency bound by a heavy rubber band. Instead of the comforting green of saved cash, a few crumpled scraps of thermal receipt paper sat lonely at the bottom. She tipped the contents onto the table, and receipts stained with translucent grease spots scattered before her eyes. The printed logo of a pair of tumbling dice stared back at her under the bold heading, "The Last Chance." Karen traced her finger over the printed totals, the cold realization dawning that $800 had vanished into thin air. The empty tin slipped from her numb fingers, clattering across the cracked linoleum and striking the leg of the table with a hollow, mocking ring. Karen smoothed out each receipt with trembling precision, reading the dates and the exact timestamps of the transactions. She recognized the address, a notorious spot on the city's edge known as a front for a subterranean gambling den. While she had been bent double in front of a smelting furnace for 2 shifts, Jim had been systematically hemorrhaging their only safety net. She saw the time stamped on the paper. The dead of night. Hours when Jim had supposedly been sleeping soundly in the next room. A wave of hot, suffocating rage rose from her stomach to her throat, choking off her breath. She realized that every cent she had saved by skipping meals and delaying her own medicine had been converted into plastic chips on a felt-covered table. The front door slammed, and Jim stumbled into the hallway, trailing the acrid scent of cheap tobacco and the sour rot of stale booze. Karen stood rooted in the center of the kitchen, clutching the empty tin in an outstretched hand. When Jim's eyes landed on her, his pace faltered, and his face drained of color until it matched the sickly gray of the walls. Karen slammed the tin onto the dining table directly under his nose. She pointed in silence at the spread of receipts, her gaze in unspoken demand for a truth he didn't possess. Jim opened his mouth, but only a jagged, incoherent rasp escaped his throat as he stared down at the undeniable evidence of his betrayal. Suddenly, Jim straightened his spine and brought his palm down on the table with a violent force that sent the receipts fluttering like dying moths. His voice cracked as he shifted into a scream, accusing Karen of spying and a lack of fundamental trust. He took a heavy step forward, invading her space and looming over her with a predatory shadow. Karen watched the veins in his forehead bulge with a terrifying, misplaced fury. Jim roared that she was suffocating him, that her constant control and her endless nagging over every nickel had driven him to seek an escape. Karen stepped back, feeling the hot spray of his spit hit her cheek as he ranted about his lost dignity. Jim made a sudden, lunging grab for the receipts, trying to crush the evidence into his fist. Karen was faster. She slammed her palm down over the papers, and Jim's fingers dug painfully into her wrist. She felt a sharp, biting ache and tried to wrench herself free, shoving her shoulder into his chest. A clumsy, desperate struggle broke out between them. Chairs toppled over with a deafening crash against the floor. Jim breathed heavily into her face, his breath a foul mix of desperation and alcohol, as he tried to pry her fingers open by sheer force. Karen dug her heels into the linoleum, refusing to yield the final proof of his deception, even as the fabric of his shirt groaned and tore under the strain of their combat. Karen looked into Jim's crimson, distorted face and abruptly stopped fighting. In that moment of stillness, the memory of endless hours spent beside white-hot steel and the deafening roar of the factory floors washed over her. She realized Jim hadn't just gambled away currency. He had squandered every hour of the life she had sacrificed to the mill. All the exhaustion she had accumulated over the years settled in her heart like a lead weight. In Jim's eyes, she saw no spark of remorse, only a primal, calculating fear. His betrayal felt deeper and filthier than any layer of Gary's industrial soot that had ever coated her skin. Karen slowly straightened her posture and began gathering the scattered receipts, folding them with deliberate care and tucking them into her jacket pocket. She ignored Jim's continuing, hollow shouts, looking right through him toward the dark, rain-streaked window. She reached out, took the house keys from the table, and squeezed them in her fist so hard the jagged metal bit into her flesh. A cold, sharp plan began to solidify in her mind, to salvage the remaining fragments of their existence. Without a single glance back at the man standing in the wreckage of their kitchen, she headed for the door. Outside, Karen killed the engine, and the old van shuddered to a halt, belching a cloud of acrid blue-gray smoke into the damp night air. Through the grime-streaked window of the Last Chance, a sickly, poisonous neon-pink light pulsed against the darkness. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, watching a familiar, hunched silhouette through the glass. Jim was sitting with his back to the entrance, enveloped in a thick, stagnant haze of cigarette smoke that drifted lazily over the green felt of a poker table. She saw him nervously rub the bridge of his nose before pulling a condensation-covered glass toward him. A low-hanging lamp illuminated the back of his head, where Karen could see beads of cold sweat glistening in the artificial light. The heavy, leather-clad door hit the interior wall with a thud as Karen burst into the stifling atmosphere of the club, which reeked of spilled whiskey and old desperation. The soles of her work boots stuck to the beer-slicked floor as she cut a path through a crowd of men in drab, gray jackets. She lunged forward, her hand snapping out to grip Jim's shoulder, bunching the coarse fabric of his windbreaker in her fist. The other players froze. Cards remained suspended in the air in the hands of a startled dealer. She felt the dry, corded tendons of Jim's shoulder tense violently under her touch. The silence in the room became so thick she could hear nothing but the ragged, shallow breathing of her stunned husband. Jim threw his chair back with a crash that sent it colliding into a neighboring table, splashing drinks across the felt. A deep, angry crimson flooded his face, and his eyes narrowed into two sharp, hateful slits. He jabbed a finger toward Karen's face, his voice breaking into a hoarse, rhythmic bark that rose above the hum of the ceiling fans. He screamed that she had turned his life into a cage with her constant accounting and her obsessive tracking of every cent. The surrounding gamblers exchanged uneasy glances as Jim continued to shake his fists, claiming she had stripped him of his manhood. Karen felt the weight of the regulars' mocking stares as Jim continued to spray spittle in his unbridled rage. Days later, Karen stood before the scarred, peeling door of the foreman's office, where the air was a heavy blend of machine oil and stale tobacco. The old foreman didn't look up. His gnarled finger moved slowly down a printed ledger where the name McAllister had been circled in thick, aggressive red marker. Karen felt the floor beneath her boots seemingly dissolve, the roar of the factory floor behind her turning into a piercing, high-pitched ring. The foreman gave a curt nod toward the column labeled "Reduction in Force, Reorganization," and Karen saw the date, the 30th of the month. Her fingers gripped the edge of the metal desk, leaving damp, frantic prints. She realized the steel giant was spitting her out like so much useless slag. Later that evening, Karen slipped into Toby's room, where the air smelled of cheap aerosol deodorant and settled dust. Reaching under the bed among empty soda cans, her hand found the slick feel of synthetic nylon. She pulled out a black bomber jacket with an embroidered snarling wolf on the back, the sigil of the North Dogs street gang. She ran her palm over the stiff embroidery, a cold, paralyzing dread tightening around her throat. In the pocket, she found a heavy folding knife with a spring-loaded blade. She pressed the weapon against her stomach, hearing the floorboards in the hallway groan under Toby's approaching footsteps. Toby froze in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, meeting Karen's gaze with a look of icy defiance. He curled his lip into a sneer when she pointed at the wolf-head jacket. He stepped into the room and snatched the garment from her hands, with a violent jerk of the sleeve. His voice sounded like dry ice as he informed her that he didn't intend to swallow factory dust for pennies like she did. He tossed a contemptuous look toward the kitchen, an obvious jab at Jim's failure, and stated he would rather die in a gutter than become a nothing like his father. The front door groaned open, and Jim stumbled inside, clutching a bundle of wilted, yellow chrysanthemums to his chest. Karen watched as he collapsed onto his knees in the foyer, staining his work pants in the tracked-in mud. He held the flowers out toward her, his hands trembling visibly and his eyes swimming with a wet, desperate sheen of repentance. He swore on his mother's grave that he would never again cross the threshold of a gambling house. Karen caught the scent of the flowers, sickly sweet and mixed with the sharp smell of peppermint gum Jim was using to mask the scent of fresh bourbon. He pressed his forehead against her knees, letting out a series of pathetic, muffled sobs. A week later, Karen pulled an envelope from the mailbox marked with a bright yellow stripe and the bank's official seal. The font on the paper seemed unnaturally large to her, screaming the past due amount and the final deadline for their mortgage. She could hear Jim in the kitchen, cheerfully whistling a tune as he clattered dishes together. She quickly rolled the notice into a tight tube and shoved it into the very bottom of the kitchen trash can, burying it under a layer of old newspapers. Her heart hammered against her ribs when Jim peered around the doorframe with a smile. She forced a hollow, fragile mask of calm onto her face, feeling a greasy layer of fear paralyze her thoughts. Karen woke in the middle of the night to a faint, rhythmic rustling and saw Jim's shadow cast by the hallway light. He was standing at the dresser, where she kept the emergency cash hidden in an old envelope beneath a stack of linens. She remained motionless, watching him carefully slide the bills out, his movements calculated to avoid any sound of crinkling paper. She saw his profile, focused, predatory, his lips pressed into a thin line of greed. When he stuffed the roll into his pocket and crept out of the bedroom on his toes, Karen buried her face in her pillow to keep from screaming. She felt a cold, yawning void fill the space where her last shred of hope had once lived. Karen ran down the midnight street, the freezing air burning her lungs like lye. She stopped at the window of the Last Chance, her hands gripping the frost-rimmed glass. Inside, she saw the dealer use a long wooden rake to sweep the last of the blue chips toward the house. Jim sat perfectly still, his shoulders slumped as if his spine had turned to water, his gaze fixed on the empty space where his money had been. She watched as he slowly turned his palms upward, staring at his empty hands in a state of disbelief. Her entire world narrowed to that single point in time, watching the final hope for their home disappear into the black slot of the counting table. A black sedan pulled silently to the curb in front of the McAllister house the following morning. Karen watched a man in a crisp, gray suit exit the vehicle, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. The process server climbed the steps without haste, producing a wide roll of adhesive tape and a bright red sheet of paper. The sharp, tearing sound of the tape echoed through the quiet street like a gunshot. The red eviction notice now sat squarely on the peeling paint of the front door, right above the deadbolt. Karen stood at the window, watching the man take a digital photo of the house for his records before driving away, leaving their shame on display for the entire neighborhood. Karen stepped onto the porch, and heavy raindrops immediately soaked through her thin sweater. Water tracked down her face, mingling with the bitter tears she no longer bothered to hide. The rhythmic thud of a series of blows hit the front door, sounding like a nail gun firing into the wood. The force caused the remaining bone china in the hutch to rattle, and dust rose from the floorboards in a gray cloud. Toby burst from the dark hallway, his shoulder clipping the frame. His eyes were blown wide, his pupils tiny black dots against a pale, terrified face. Karen watched him grip the stair railing as the echo of the pounding continued to vibrate through the cramped foyer. Outside, the rain roared, and water splashed over the threshold, a herald of the coming violence. The wood groaned and splintered as two men forced their way in, bringing the smell of wet leather and cheap cologne. One of them, with a face like a slab of cured meat, stepped toward the kitchen table. He snapped his hand out, and a crumpled, grease-stained sheet of paper hit the oilcloth. Karen saw Jim's signature at the bottom, a shaky, pathetic scrawl. The blue ink had bled in the dampness, turning a promise of payment into an ugly, spreading blot. Karen looked from the debt note to the visitor's heavy fists, which clenched and unclenched in time with his thick, rasping breath. The collector in the leather jacket closed the distance and grabbed Toby by the collar of his t-shirt, lifting him onto his toes. The fabric choked the boy, forcing a strangled wheeze from his throat. The man leaned into Karen's face, his breath smelling of burnt coffee and stale tobacco. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, as he promised her a bright bonfire where their roof used to be by dawn. Karen watched a scar on the collector's cheek twitch as he explained the exact price of their continued delay. Toby kicked at the air, his feet failing to find the floor, while Karen felt a frozen spike of terror paralyze her spine. Karen lunged for the wall where the telephone hung, her fingers stabbing frantically at the buttons. The second collector, who had been guarding the door, made a lightning-fast move and caught her wrist. With a sharp, plastic snap, the copper wire was ripped from the wall, coiling on the floor like a dead snake. The man let out a short, barking laugh, showing yellowed teeth. Karen stared at her hands, which were shaking with a fine, uncontrollable tremor. The man tossed a heavy ring of keys in the air, watching her with the lazy, predatory confidence of a hunter who had cornered his prey in a place where no laws reached. When the heavy footsteps of the men finally faded from the porch, Karen went into the bedroom and dropped to her knees before an old oak chest. The hinges gave a long, reaching groan, revealing stacks of yellowed linens. She reached under a false bottom, her fingers finding a coarse, oil-soaked bundle. She unwrapped the rag, revealing the dull, matte finish of her father's old service revolver. The smell of gun oil filled the room, scrubbing away the lingering stench of the intruders. Karen pressed the cold steel against her cheek, feeling something inside her finally snap, turning into a jagged shard of ice that was ready to cut anyone who stood in her way. With a dry click, Karen swung the cylinder out to check the loads. The brass casings glowed dully in the dim light of the bedroom. Toby stood in the doorway, hugging himself and shaking. His voice was a pathetic whimper as he begged her to drop the gun and lock herself in the bathroom. Karen felt the weight of the revolver anchor her hand, providing a terrifying, newfound clarity. Toby took a step forward to block her path, but she shoved him aside with a cold, mechanical force. Her gaze had gone flat and distant, looking through the walls of the house and straight into the throat of the storm outside. Karen pushed the front door open and stepped into a wall of freezing water that immediately saturated her wool coat. The wind whipped rain into her eyes, but she didn't blink, her fingers tightening around the grip of the revolver in her pocket. She heard Toby's muffled cry behind her, but the roar of the downpour swallowed the sound. She walked through the mud toward the garage, where a rusted hinge beat against the wall with a rhythmic, metallic clang. Every step through the muck felt like a march toward a gallows, but her hand on the weapon remained steady, warmed by a feverish, desperate resolve. She jumped behind the wheel of the van and turned the key, forcing the engine to give a dying, mechanical rattle. Her eyes fell on the fuel gauge, where the needle sat hopelessly on the red line. Karen slammed her fist against the steering wheel, the horn letting out a short, sharp cry that pierced the rain. Rage boiled in her chest as she realized Jim had siphoned the last of the gas for one more trip to the abyss. She clenched her teeth until her jaw ached. She had exactly one chance to reach the club, and the van, coughing blue smoke, rolled slowly onto the flooded highway. The van shuddered to a stop at the curb, and through the rain-slicked glass, Karen saw the neon sign pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. Inside the club, Jim sat in a pool of yellow light, looking like a wax figure. She watched as he slowly slid his wedding ring off his finger, leaving a pale, ghostly band on his skin. Beside it, on the felt, he placed the family watch with its cracked crystal, pushing them toward the center of the table with shaking fingers. His face looked like a hollow mask to her, drained of all reason. She watched the dealer indifferently cover their family history with a mechanical, greedy hand. Karen felt for the hammer of the revolver and pulled it back until it gave a sharp, dry click that vibrated through her palm. She threw her shoulder against the heavy oak door of the club, bursting into the room with a swirl of spray and freezing air. The stagnant cloud of smoke under the ceiling tore apart in the draft, exposing the startled faces of the gamblers. Rain dripped from the hem of her coat, forming a dark, spreading pool on the carpet. She stood in the doorway, a black silhouette against the storm, her breath coming in jagged whistles. Her gaze pinned Jim to his seat while her hand in her pocket began to rise. She took 3 heavy steps toward the center of the room, and the hum of voices cut out like a severed wire. Players shoved back from the tables, dropping cards and chips that clattered across the floor. Under the thin fabric of her coat, the predatory outline of the barrel was unmistakable, pointed at the heart of the establishment. Karen's eyes burned with a dry, manic light that left no room for hesitation. She saw the guard by the bar freeze, his hand hovering near his holster, but unable to move under the weight of her stare. The silence in the club became so sharp, she could hear the individual raindrops hitting the tile by the entrance. Karen whipped the revolver out of her pocket and leveled it. The barrel came to rest an inch from the dealer's forehead. The man in the vest turned a sickly shade of white, his fingers, heavy with cheap rings, immediately splaying open. The gold wedding band hit the green felt with a tiny metallic ring, followed by the old watch. Karen watched a bead of sweat roll down the dealer's temple and vanish into his collar. The gun didn't waver. The dealer stepped back, raising his palms, while Karen locked her eyes on the relics he had almost swallowed. With her free hand, she reached into her pocket and whipped out a heavy set of keys. The metal hit the table with a bone-dry thud, bouncing on the felt in front of the stunned dealer. Karen announced that the old van was the last of their property, the final stake this table would ever see from them. The keychain, a battered leather strap, sat in a puddle of spilled gin. A silence settled over the room, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. Karen stood frozen, her fingers white against the revolver's grip, her only means of transportation now offered to the gambling madness of the basement. Her voice broke the silence, a hoarse roar filled with years of accumulated poison. She spat out words about the years spent at the furnaces while Jim turned their blood and sweat into trash. She scanned the players, whose faces were mere gray blurs in the gloom. The guard by the wall lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. She hammered out every word, describing how Jim had cut the heart out of their home, piece by piece, for this sticky table. The air felt electric, and even the hardest gamblers looked away, crushed by the weight of her naked truth. Jim let out a sound like a gut-shot animal and buried his face in his hands. His legs gave way, and he slid from the stool, his knees hitting the ash-strewn floor. His shoulders shook with a silent, racking sob, his head coming to rest against the leg of the poker table. Karen looked at his huddled form through the sights of the revolver, seeing only a pile of wet rags. Jim's tears left clean tracks on his dusty cheeks. But Karen didn't move. The entire room watched the final collapse of a man who had been reduced to a shadow under the gaze of his own wife. Karen made a sharp move forward and swept the gold in the watch into her fist. The metal was familiar and cold, her pulse thrumming against the stolen-back pieces of her life. Without looking away from the dealer, she slowly lowered the revolver and shoved it back into her coat. The weight of the weapon felt natural now. She squared her shoulders, her face a mask of stone. A sigh of relief rippled through the room, but Karen ignored them, her fingers tight around the returned past she had refused to let go. She stepped toward Jim and grabbed the collar of his sweat-stained jacket. With a violent jerk, she forced him to his feet, ignoring his weak stumbling. She dragged him behind her, cutting through the crowd like a blade. The heavy door swung open, and a wall of rain hit her. She shoved Jim onto the sidewalk, where the water immediately began to wash the smell of tobacco from his skin. He tripped on the curb, but her iron grip on his neck kept him from falling into the gutter. Karen stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and looked one last time at the van, its headlights staring blindly into the dark. The machine, the price of their freedom from the debt, looked like a rolling coffin to her now. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out the empty cookie tin. With a violent heave, she threw it into the storm drain, where it hit the grate with a metallic clang and sank. She watched the water swirl around the trash, taking the last of their old life with it. Now she had only empty hands and a heavy gun. The two of them trudged along the highway, hugging the edge of the asphalt. Every flash of lightning illuminated their soaked figures, Karen's straight, defiant spine and Jim's broken silhouette. Her boots squelched in the clay, and the spray from passing trucks coated them in grit. Jim walked a few paces behind, his head down like a beaten dog. Karen didn't look back. She navigated by the sound of his ragged breathing. Thunder rolled over the flats of Indiana, drowning the rain, and the only landmarks were the sickly yellow lights of Gary on the horizon. Karen pushed the front door open, the smell of damp rot welcoming them back. In the low light of the kitchen, she saw Toby huddled on the sofa. He was clutching the black nylon jacket with the wolf on the back, his knuckles white. He looked up at her with eyes full of a wild, animal fear. Karen saw his jaw trembling at the sight of them. The room smelled of ozone and terror, and the gang jacket on the floor looked like a viper ready to strike at the heart of what was left. Karen slammed her hand onto the kitchen table, making both Jim and Toby jump. She laid a scrap of newspaper and a pencil stub before them, demanding absolute silence. Under the flickering bulb, she began to scratch out numbers, building a strategy for survival out of their wreckage. Jim looked at his empty hands, and Toby slowly pushed the North Dog's jacket away from him. Karen dictated the terms. Every cent, every hour of labor, and every step now belonged to that scrap of paper. The kitchen felt like a war room, with Karen taking the role of the only commander left in a hopeless battle against the dark. Karen stepped onto the porch as the sky over Gary began to turn the color of a fresh bruise. The cold morning air stung her nose, clearing the last of the night's fever. She watched the heavy gray smog over the steel mill begin to tear into tatters under the first light. A pale orange glow hit the cracked asphalt and the boarded-up houses, giving the ruins a ghostly, temporary majesty. Karen took a deep breath, tasting the familiar grit of coal and the sharp scent of rain. The horizon was clearing, and the silhouettes of the smokestacks no longer looked like bars, but merely a landscape she would have to conquer all over again. Karen felt a warm touch and saw Jim's hand cautiously cover her fingers. "The end, do not proceed past this point,"